It's time once again for another edition of Talk to Me. And now, here's Emmy himself, 8-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, Maynard Eaton.
Hello again, and welcome to Talk to Me, a weekly conversation with business leaders, political influencers, and cultural icons. This week, we have one of the most top political minds in the state, if not the country. Please welcome Justice Leah Ward Sears. Thank you so much for joining us in a week that's been full of legal controversy, if you will.
It has indeed, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be with you on your show today, Maynard. I appreciate it.
Justice Sears, you've known Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and what difference did she make in the court? She was a pioneer, much like you. What are your thoughts about her passing and the political controversy that's erupted since her death?
Well, the first answer to your first question, we've lost a wonderful jurist, a wonderful woman, a real leader in this country. And I was very, very sorry to hear that she had died. Shocked a little, even though I know that she had been weary and very sick for a very long time. She was my North Star. I'm about 20 years behind her professionally. We both went to Cornell University and made the same track through Ivy League law. Well, I went to Emory, but through law schools and all of that. And times were really, really difficult for her. They were tough because she was Jewish, she was a woman, and she was a mother. 20 years later, I came on the scene in Atlanta, in Georgia, and nationally, as you mentioned. And they weren't all that easy for me either, but they were much easier for me because she, in her 6 cases and numbers of cases before the Supreme Court of the United States, and her other cases that she worked on when she was volunteering for the ACLU, she broke down barriers for me. And the job's not yet done. We still have a long way to go for parity and justice for all of us who are minorities, but she helped do that, and my heart goes out to her and her family.
I think I read somewhere last night that, correct me if I'm wrong, that women could not open a bank account without their husbands until she came along. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, it was bad. I don't know if you ever saw the show Mad Men. It was a show on television that kind of took us back to the early 60s, but I was born in June of 1955, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do what I wanted to do, that is become a lawyer and break down barriers for African Americans and women, is I could see that it was going to be difficult to live a wholesome life outside of the box that we were put in. There were places where, women couldn't be raped by their husbands. You couldn't open bank accounts. You couldn't get your own credit. All kinds of things that we would call crazy things now.
Right.
Even the cases that she argued where a woman couldn't get Frontiero, her very first case before the Supreme Court, where a woman couldn't get a housing allowance as an officer in the Army, but a man could get a housing allowance. All of this based on that we have to protect our women because they're basically children and they need our protection. And that wasn't it at all. It was just flat discrimination. But those were and she had to argue before benches of judges and justices who were all men who had never heard this. Never thought about. I had, for instance, a wonderful father, really believed in our education. But when I started talking about becoming a lawyer and going to the Supreme Court, he was born in 1927, a black man. He was like, is that possible? That's not possible. it's just not possible. You need to marry a nice doctor and, teach. And
We talk so much
nothing
about.
wrong with teaching. My mother was a teacher, but if you wanted to do anything other than that, it was, if you wanted to be a bricklayer or a doctor or anything else, it was foreclosed to you. It just wasn't available.
We hear so much about racism, but you're opening my eyes, and Judge Ginsburg opened my eyes. Gender bias was almost as strong as racism, was it not?
Yeah, if not more, because and by the way, racial bias is tough. I mean, it is tough. So, but if you're if how do I put it? Gender bias for many people, including African Americans, seems justifiable because women and men are in fact different. It's very hard to rationalize discrimination based on the colors of people's skin, but it's easier to rationalize discrimination based on, gender differences. The fact that I can have biological children and all this. And it was just one of those things. Even African Americans thought of it as just a natural order of things. If you go into the so-called developing countries, they see, who aren't where we are, if we're going in the right direction. And I do wonder about that sometimes, but that's another story. That gender bias is just one of those things in most areas of the world. No one thinks anything of it. Even women think nothing of it. It's just how women are supposed to be. Yeah.
The second part of that original question was, what happens to the U.S. Supreme Court now? There's a political battle ensuing about the next nomination, and if it's a conservative, will likely change America for decades to come. As a former Chief Justice yourself of the state court, what are you forecasting about where the court goes and what it will mean to this country?
Well, I believe that the U.S. Supreme Court, unlike most Supreme Courts around the country, has been terribly damaged. The court has been damaged the courts are not supposed to be partisan. They are, law is supposed to be blind. And it's not at the U.S. Supreme Court. It's not, and it is more difficult. There are two justice systems, and we've got to not for blacks and for whites, or blacks and browns and whites, and that's something that we're going to have to ameliorate if we want our country to survive, frankly, and if we want the court to survive as the institution that the founders of the Constitution designed it to be. It's going to have to be reformed. That reform may come in the way of term limits. I think justices now serve way longer than any justices used to serve in the history of this country. They come on longer, serve much longer. 45 years is too long for anybody, liberal, conservative, or moderate, to hold that much power. I'd like to see 18-year term limits, maybe a few more justices on the court. It wasn't popular when Roosevelt tried to pack the courts in his time, but maybe it is time to do that. I know Buttigieg has a 5-5-5 plan where there's 5 moderates, 5 conservatives, and then they pick 5 extra justices who serve for 1 year, all in the moderate range. But whatever it is, we need to commission or somebody to look at the court, and it needs to go back to the nonpartisan institution of government that it was designed to be. And it's not anymore, because with this, you did this to me and I'm going to do it to you, and they're going to turn around and do it back to them, and all this kind of. So that's just not the way that courts are supposed to work. That's the way legislators work, and clearly the president, but not the courts. They are the non-political branch of government.
At least according to the Constitution, right?
According to the Constitution. And I'm not naive. They have become a very much a political branch of government, and that is a bad thing. This
has become a very political summer with regard to street protests about police brutality, racial injustice, and judicial reform. Before we get to Breonna Taylor's case, what has this summer meant to you? What, as a jurist, what have you wrought from? What have you gotten from this summer's protests and activity, and Breonna Taylor's and all the other killings that have gone on? It's been a really rough and tumble summer. How do you see it?
I am sorry this is all happening, but thrilled that because I've worked almost exclusively in all white environments where most of my colleagues just have not understood that systemic racism exists. And I mean, I talk to whites all the time that think that there is no racism if there is no malice. And that's just not true. You know, as racism exists in terms of housing and schooling and you know, just you don't necessarily have to have malice. You can be ignorant, and there are all kinds of policies that just discriminate against Black and brown people and have for years. And it's not something that as an African American, I'm not going to be like the immigrants that have come from Europe who were other when they first got here, like Italians or Jews or Irish, who at some point just become white people. I'm not, as an African American, I'll never blend in like that. I don't have the opportunity to be designated white after a generation or so. So we're going to have to deal with that. And I think I like the fact that there needed to be a reckoning on race, because I felt it every single day of my life. And people don't understand that, you know, but they're beginning to. I've been asked more questions. People have taken me aside, and white people, and said, I apologize. I just didn't realize. Many of my friends thought because I got to the Supreme Court over them that I had it all going on, that there was no racism for me. And not at all. I had to, what was a straight path for a white man was a huge obstacle course for me. I had to go over and under and scoot around and do all like that to make it to where to get to where I had to be. It wasn't easy.
Yeah. But 17 years as a chief justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, a Southern court, one would think you'd risen above all the systemic racism that trouble other folks. But it wasn't that easy, was it, as you just said?
No, it's not. It's just not possible. You know, and I was 4 years as Chief Justice, 17 years on the court. But no, I know I'm always having to, even now, work harder to prove that I'm just as adequate as somebody that has less qualifications than I do. You know, I know the bias, the unconscious bias. You know, I live in Buckhead now, and I was in a large condominium complex near Paces Ferry Road, and I was riding into my complex yesterday. It has all kinds of stops and gates and all this kind of stuff. And somebody who lived in the building stopped me and asked me what I was doing here. You know,
wow.
I live here. You know, and I'm always, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that, but it's just unconscious bias. You don't expect me to be here. And it's all the time. I mean, it's just all the time. My daughter, for example, is in a relationship. She's married to a white guy. When they go out, people don't believe they're together. They'll be at some place and they'll say, "Can I seat you?" And oh, you're together, that kind. I mean, it's just all the time, everywhere, everywhere. And my son-in-law is beginning to see that. Oh, this is going to be the rest of my life, and it probably will be.
I'm married to a white woman, and we experience much the same thing. Interracial marriages are not easy, but it wasn't easy for you either. It wasn't easy for you either when you got to that court. You would tell me yesterday that things were tough when you got to the Supreme Court. Were they not? That you were just looked down upon or ignored, or
ignored. I mean, basically ignored. And when I mean, not all the time. There was a judge. There's always a judge or two. When I got to the Supreme Court, who took me aside, Willis Hunt, and he took me aside and he said, "Listen, I've been reading some of what you're writing, and it's just brilliant. And you just keep doing what you're doing, okay? But for the most part, a large part, it was ignored. I'd say something, and people would just move on to the next subject, and then they might come back around again and say what I just said, and it's just." But that started to get better as time. It wasn't always like that. It started off like that when I was 36 years old on a court with all men, one of whom was black. Justice Benham, Robert Benham from Cartersville. Everybody else was white, 60 and over, and so even being young was probably a big problem.
Attorney Benjamin Crump, Breonna Taylor's attorney, said after the decision not to indict 3 policemen in Louisville that black women are victims of an unjust system. Now, again, you've been the top legal mind in the state for a while. Is that true? Black women really are victims of an unjust legal system, you think?
Yes. I think it's obvious from the police brutality that we've been seeing that black men have been victims of an unjust legal system, but black women have too. I can tell you, just even as a superior court judge, other judges didn't. We were trying to get alimony. We don't need alimony. We just need diapers or something. It's just, you're looked down on like you just don't have the same needs as a white woman would. Remember now, it is the black women, for the most part, that are the mothers and daughters and aunts and all that of black men. And I wake up, I've got a son who has graduated one of the top of his class at UVA. It's sad I have to say that, and then he's got a master's in meteorology from Penn State, and he's working on a degree in robotics from Johns Hopkins, a PhD. And I worry, he lives out in Tahoe. Are they just somebody gonna just rough him up because he's a black man? That would kill me. I mean, and I worry about my daughter too. So we're all in the thing. My husband was walking on the Beltline in Atlanta with our dog when we lived in Midtown, and somebody asked him. He asked, "Why don't you have your dog on a leash?" And she said, we don't have to have our dogs on leashes here. You should go back to your own neighborhood. And again, we lived there. Haskell, a dark-skinned black man, feels that he has to wear like an American flag, or never can wear a hoodie or a Georgia symbol or something like that, even though he graduated from Clark, just as a sort of a sign of peace as he's walking around the neighborhood, walking the dog. It's tough.
Now, for many people listening to this, you would think what you just explained would be lower income, inner city black folks. You're an exceptional family. Just listen to the accomplishments of your son. But the same racial bias, the same fear of being black exists for buckhead matrons like yourself, as well as lower income people. Is that correct?
That's right. Because, first of all, we shouldn't have to, but I did. And I shouldn't have to wear on my chest, Cornell, UVA, Emory, I'm okay. I'm just, whites don't have to do that, but we're always having to, we're okay because we got the right credentials kind of type thing.
Right. I'm living,
yeah, I mean, that shouldn't have to be. Whites don't have to, and they'll have a University of South Georgia at Peabody, and I'll have Cornell, and they're the same as me. They're treated the same. It's just like, but you shouldn't have to be like the bird watcher in Central Park. You don't have to have a Harvard degree and sit on the New York Audubon Society to be treated okay because you're black. I mean, it should just be okay. But you will see, it doesn't matter how much education you get, how far you stay in the box, how hard you try. Racism is if you are African American, is the lowest you can go in our society, and it's been that way, and it hasn't changed, and hopefully it will change a little bit. It might change a little bit because of this.
Is judicial reform needed to change that? Or the attorneys or courts responsible for much of this attitude?
I believe that the reason for the judicial reform was economic. We can't, it was mainly done by Republicans. Nothing wrong with that. If it gets to the goal, I'm okay with it. But we were paying millions and billions of dollars to house. I mean, we house more people, more African Americans, but more American citizens more citizens than any country on the face of the earth, other than maybe one. That had to change. Yeah, and I think the real impetus was economic. We just don't want to pay for it anymore. But that's fine if that means that we take people who have drug offense, who need medical help, who have mental problems, who have addictions and all of that, and stop throwing them into jail and get them treatment, which is a lot cheaper. Okay, if we put more of our funding into daycare than the death penalty so that children have a shot going forward, in kindergarten than in our jails, I'm happy with that. I mean, we need to put our funds where it's going to make a difference.
Finally, Dr. Charles Steele, the president of SCLC, who I work with, says the Breonna Taylor judicial case was a miscarriage of justice. What are your thoughts about what happened there? I passing through Louisville last night. It was eerie. It's a town it's very tense. Your thoughts about Breonna Taylor?
So, so I have thoughts as a jurist and then thoughts as a person. I believe, I think, for the most part, in the grand jury and jury system. And I trust it probably more than many people do. I don't make judgments based on what I see on TV, although some things are pretty blatant and it's hard to look away. With all that said, it's hard before a grand jury when the defense, remember now, the victims don't get to appear before the grand jury. It's just a charging body. The prosecutors do. And I just, based on what I know or seen or read about, it's just, I mean, you could get a grand jury pretty much to indict a ham sandwich if you want to. So there were no indictments that the jury might have ultimately said, no, not guilty, but I don't understand it. I do not understand it, but that's all I can say. I don't know what was presented. In Georgia, the police officers can actually come in to a grand jury proceeding and try to defend themselves. But I would have to guess that all the evidence wasn't there. That's what I would have to guess based on what I've read. But I'm willing to be convinced. I was trained for years and years, 17 on the Supreme Court and 4 on the Superior Court of Fulton County, and then on lower courts before that. So I am trained to hear I want to hear it in the courtroom, not on CNN. But it does make me wonder. It does. CNN's fine. I love the media.
Thank you so much. I could talk to you for another half hour, but we have time constraints. But they talk about the notorious RBG. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the notorious LWS. What a distinguished career you had.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We want to thank our sponsors for helping us fund this program, Talk to Me. And thank you for joining us. Thank Rick Clear for producing it, Atlanta Video Network. Thank you. See you next week. Thank you, Judge.
Okay. Take care. See you later. Be safe. Take care. Bye-bye.